It started at 11:42 p.m., that hour when the city's noise turns soft and the quiet says louder things. Up on the executive floor, the lights still burned like a stubborn crown across the glass, and behind one of those panes stood a man whose last name had long ago become a brand. Blackwell. He didn't look like the magazine covers. He looked like what happens after the applause, when the room empties and you're left with the echo of decisions nobody else had to make. 12 floors down, Adrienne nudged her laptop an inch farther from her face, the way you do when you want the numbers to behave. 2 coffee cups sat beside her keyboard, one with lipstick like a timestamp of earlier optimism, the other gone cold and honest. She'd read the email twice already. Variance in procurement, routine reconciliation tomorrow. A harmless sentence wearing a tie. She smiled without humor and opened the spreadsheets like you open a door you already know is stuck from the inside. People say numbers don't lie. That's adorable. Numbers lie all the time, they just do it politely. What they don't do is fail to line up when the pattern is real. And what she traced that night wasn't noise or a one-off. It was choreography. Small, tasteful adjustments spread across vendors with names that sounded like legally approved coughs. A shipping delta here, a service credit reversed there, a late fee that existed and then quietly didn't. Each by itself looked like the universe shrugging. Together, they looked like a siphon taught to whisper. Adrienne didn't talk to herself. She kept receipts. Not the petty kind, the survival kind. Flags she'd left in old threads. Dates in the margins of printed POs. Voice memos recorded in her car at red lights because thoughts are cowards unless you catch them live. 6 months of those breadcrumbs now lit up on her screen like runway lights. She took a breath, saved her work, and stood. The elevator to the executive level is silent in a way that makes you hear your own pulse. The doors opened on a hallway that turned air into mirrors. She walked past framed art, chosen to make power look sophisticated, and stopped at the corner office where a thin line of light still cut under the door. She knocked. A pause just long enough to sound like a choice, and then Blackwell opened it. Adrienne. Recognition, relief, and the wish for good news lived in the 3 notes of her name. "I found something," she said. No preamble. He didn't like preamble, not after midnight. He gestured her in. The window behind him sliced the city into shards. She set her laptop on the desk, pulled up the ledger, and walked him through the pattern. You could see the change in his posture, not panic. Blackwell didn't panic. Calculation. When did this start? Who signed what? How does it look if it gets out? Who benefits from the confusion? He asked the right questions and one wrong one. The wrong one sounded like protection. Can we contain it? And rooms make a sound when a line gets crossed. It isn't loud, it's the air stepping back. Adrienne let that quiet sit until it got awkward. Then, "We can fix it." He didn't flinch. "What do you need?" "Full access to vendor contracts for the last 18 months. A meeting with legal at 8. And your word." He's time to a calming. He didn't ask for clarification. He knew which word. Not a PR word, not a "we regret any inconvenience" word, one of the expensive ones. "My word," he said. Saying it out loud made it heavier, the way promises grow bones when you speak them. If you're wondering why she came straight to him instead of sending an anonymous note to compliance, it's because machines don't eat themselves. They eat the smallest person standing closest. Adrienne wasn't naive. She had Rent, a half-finished novel in a drawer. A mother who texted recipes she never cooked. She also had a line in her head that tall buildings didn't move. When she left his office, it was 12:19 a.m. The exit sign winked like a dare. He stayed behind, staring at the place her laptop had been. People like him are trained to believe in control. This was control's opposite. Truth. Blackwell made 2 calls. The first to security routine, unobtrusive. The second was to himself, the private vow people make when the ground under their feet shifts. He pulled procurement logs onto the screen. Numbers were his first language. The city, the deals, the flights, the right tables, those were dialects he learned later. He scanned vendor names that tried to look bland. A handful stood out not because they were large, but because they were tidy. Safe amounts, consistent rhythms, the illusion of normalcy. This wasn't sloppy theft. It was elegant choreography in soft shoes. Downstairs, a vacuum whined at the 20th floor. Adrienne returned to her desk and drafted the morning agenda, a list of verbs disguised as bullet points. She scheduled the coffee run with military precision. She copied a folder to a thumb drive, because she doesn't trust servers that smile too much. At 12:47 a.m., an email slipped in wearing the standard uniform first, last at company, but the subject line knew her nickname. Not Adrienne. The nickname only a few interns used because she had once confessed. It made her feel like college again. The subject said, "Saw you upstairs. Maybe we can help each other." Who? Heat rose in her chest, not fear exactly, more like recognition of a trap set with etiquette and correct punctuation. She didn't click the link. She saved it. She printed it because a grandmother's ghost in her said, "Paper can't get hacked." She didn't forward it. She put on her coat and stepped into air that smelled like imminent rain. Now, this is the branch point where a different story ends. In that version, she goes home, sleeps badly, and hopes the morning will be simpler than the night. But Adrienne had a rule. If something tries to talk you into secrecy, bring it into the light. Maybe not a floodlight, but enough to show shadows where to stand. 3 blocks away, a diner stayed open for the kind of people who work on new selves. The waitress knew her face. The coffee arrived without asking. Adrienne opened her notebook and made 2 lists. Left side, vendors, dates, amounts, intersections. Right side, who would be in the 8 a.m. meeting. She circled 3 names, drew a line between a vendor and a person, and felt the hair on her arms rise. There are sentences that change stories. Sometimes they're just one word. "Oh," she whispered. Not about guilt, about pressure. Who has the authority to approve very small, very ordinary adjustments that add up to polite bleeding? Not the CFO, not directly. Not legal wrong altitude. Operations maybe. Supply chain, likely. But the linchpin, the person nobody questions because they make everything happen on time. She didn't write the name. She didn't need to. If she was wrong, she could survive embarrassment. If she was right, she'd have to survive something else. She sent a text to Blackwell. No details. Just, "For tomorrow. Bring someone who will ask you the question you least want to answer." He wasn't a 1 a.m. texter. She didn't expect a reply, but the phone buzzed. Already invited him. Him could only mean one person. Not a board member, not a lawyer. The chief of staff friend from the years when dinner came in takeout boxes, and their calendar had more white space than meetings. The man who never allowed burials. He wrote everything down, but not just numbers. Promises. At 1:23 a.m., Adrienne walked home through a city in costume change. She didn't rehearse speeches. She made tea, sat on the floor, and tried to remember the last time she felt this odd mix of tender, determined, and a little afraid. Morning doesn't break in glass buildings. It simply arrives. By 7:42, she was at her desk. The office had the jitter of an anthill someone had nudged with a shoe. People were early without saying why. The variance thread sprouted replies like a stubborn weed. "Any updates? Per our last." Looping in X. You know the chorus. Blackwell walked in at 7:55 without an entourage. The chief of staff arrived at 7:57, handed him a paper notebook pen already clipped and said, "You should write this part." Blackwell didn't argue. He preferred pen on days that required being human. At 8, legal sat down and tried to look neutral. They landed on concerned but billable. Procurement looked like someone had told them not to worry. The CFO wore a tie that said, "We are the adults." Operations dropped into a chair like chairs had never done them a favor. Adrienne took a seat at the edge. Not the wall, not the head. The place where truth usually sits. Within reach, not ostentatious. We have a problem, Blackwell said. No preamble for him either. And we're going to deal with it. Adrienne presented like a person turning in homework she knew was right. Screens lit. Files opened. For a few minutes, the room learned to breathe in unison. An attorney asked about exposure. The CFO asked about magnitude. Procurement began a sentence with respect, which is a warning label for what comes next. The chief of staff leaned forward. What don't we want to know? Silence. The kind that shoves people back into their actual size. Blackwell answered first. I don't want to know that we looked away because it was convenient. He glanced at Adrienne. And I don't want to know that the person who found it pays the price for bringing it here. The floor found itself under the table again. Operations cleared his throat. With respect, of course, we shouldn't make assumptions. We should conduct a thorough internal review before. Adrienne waited for his sentence to land. We started that review 6 months ago. We called it reconciliation. But when reconciliation keeps finding the same hole dressed up in different numbers, you're not reconciling. You're bleeding politely. She put a number on the screen. Not big enough to trend. Big enough to cancel a clinic day at the free medical van. Sometimes, not big enough is a lullaby people sing to budgets. Walk us through the approval flow, the chief of staff said to procurement. 5 steps. 2 signatures. Automated flags for anomalies. It all sounded like safety. Here's a secret. Systems are stories we tell ourselves about safety. Stories can be true and still leave a door open. Who had override authority? He asked. A pause. A glance. A title that hides in plain sight. Director of Vendor Relations. Blackwell wrote the name but didn't say it. Saying names too early turns humans into case files. Legal leaned in with questions. The CFO began a spreadsheet in his head. Operations came up short on oxygen. Adrienne moved the cursor to a thin line item that looked ordinary, so ordinary it was invisible. Exception approvals for shipping adjustments, fee waivers, credit reversals. She pulled the thread. On the screen, small approvals unrolled into a neat list of micro-exceptions that had been waved through because the checkboxes felt like accountability. Who designed this exception path? The chief of staff asked. It's standard, procurement said, sounding genuinely confused. Standard where? Adrienne asked. Not a trap, a light, a beat. Recommended during our last vendor integration by an external consultant. Outsiders make easy scapegoats. Except the consultant's name had appeared twice before in older contracts that looped back to someone in-house. The door had a welcome mat. Blackwell's voice remained level. We're stopping all payments through that path immediately. Legal, draft notices. CFO, freeze related accounts quietly. Operations. Identify every touchpoint this path used. Procurement, find me the director. He turned to Adrienne. Gratitude has 2 kinds. The performative and the kind that changes your face without permission. He wore the second. Stay, he said, not an order, a choice. She stayed. They spent the next hour on repair instead of theater. Not the PR kind. The root and soil kind. They renamed the language on the whiteboard because words shape behavior. Exception became red flag request. People don't click a red flag lightly. Variance became unexplained deviation. And everyone needed a narrative 3 sentences that a stranger could understand or it didn't pass. Stories, it turns out, are excellent auditors. By noon, the building had changed weather. The director of vendor relations sat in a small room with a large table and 2 lawyers. Legal knitted a net. Procurement tried not to gossip and failed. The CFO developed a new respect for adjectives. Blackwell grew quiet, not sulking, recalibrating. He finally looked at the window. I used to look at this city and feel like it was a story I'd written, he said to no one in particular. Now it feels like a story I'm finally reading. Adrienne stood a measured distance from him. Reading is where the learning is. He half smiled. You didn't sleep. Neither did you. He rubbed his temple. I want to go see the clinic van. Now? Now. If we can't explain this to the nurse who runs it, we haven't fixed anything. They went down together, without cameras, without a memo. The nurse didn't do awe, she did triage. When he asked what would break first if the van disappeared for a week, she said, insulin, then kids' inhalers. After that, trust. Trust. The word we bruise by overusing. He nodded like someone who'd finally set down a weight he'd been carrying wrong. They stood in the aisle that smelled like sterile wipes and second chances. We're going to fix it, he said to the nurse, the van, and the part of himself that had liked exceptions too much. Back at the office, the lobby straightened its shoulders like lobbies do when the boss appears. An email waited on Adrian's screen when they returned. Same address, same neat tone. It's bigger than you think. Meet me tonight. Alone. That word again, alone, as if truth were a club that hated chaperones. Adrian didn't go to a diner this time. She went to the chief of staff. He didn't blink. We're not meeting anyone alone, he said. We're meeting people with lights on. He wrote a room number on a sticky note, a conference room with too many windows. Evening turned the office gold, the kind of light that makes everything look like a memory while it's still happening. Legal drafted. Operations learned how to say, we're changing this without sneering. Procurement set their jaw and did the checklist again, but slower. Blackwell stood in his doorway, and for a moment, the world held its breath. Adrian handed him a folder. Not thick, just enough. You know what I admire most? He asked. She waited. You don't enjoy being right. You just want us to be better. 5, 9, that's the job, she said. Even when it isn't. The clock found 6:12. People drifted toward dinners and children and shows. The executive floor kept its light like a signal. And somewhere, in a room with too many windows, chairs were arranged for a meeting that wanted to be a secret but had already made one mistake. It invited the light. They set the room on purpose glass on 3 sides, the kind of transparency that makes everyone adjust their posture. No blinds, no shadows pretending to be furniture. The chief of staff arrived first and did the quiet choreography of preparation. A carafe of water, a legal pad, pens that worked. Adrian checked the recorder not for drama, for memory. If truth is the work, memory is the payroll. At 7:03 p.m., the door opened and a man in a charcoal blazer hesitated like the air had rules he needed to relearn. He carried nothing but a phone and the sort of confidence that erodes when the furniture is honest. The emailer. He had the right uniform subtle watch, shoes that said, expense report, but his eyes kept darting to the corners that didn't exist. You asked for a loan, the chief of staff said, not unkindly, nodding at the windows. This is as close as we get. The man's smile tried to be amused and landed closer to weary. I thought we were on the same side. That depends, Blackwell said, stepping in behind him. No entourage, just gravity. What side do you think we're on? Our side. The man looked at Adrian when he said it, like he was offering her a lift out of something she didn't know she was in. The side that keeps the trains moving. Adrian clicked her pen. Tell us what you think is bigger. He sat, and the chair made a sound like truth clearing its throat. You found the exceptions pathway, he said, voicing it like a compliment. You haven't found the hub. The chief of staff folded his hands. Then help us. I'm not a whistleblower, the man said, as if the word itself owed him money. I'm a realist. You can cut off one path and the flow will find another. That's how systems work. His purse tan. Water finds cracks, Adrian said. But people carve them. Tea? He tilted his head, weighing the friction of being clever in the wrong room. You remember the integration last spring? He looked at procurement's empty chair as if it could answer him by remote control. We brought on 3 vendors in a compressed window. That wasn't an accident. The external consultant was one of ours. Define ours, the chief of staff said. He used to be in-house, the man replied, left to hang his own shingle, but somebody kept the door unlatched. He wrote the exception language, called it best practice. The director of vendor relations shepherded it through. Blackwell didn't blink. Motivation? I have the man, who was said a 9. Money, the man said. But not like you think, not duffel bags, not a wire to the Caymans. His smile managed an inch. Sponsorships. A speaking circuit. Equity in a data optimization company that has no customers, and 2 decks that look suspiciously like the same deck. And, you? The chief of staff asked. Where do you live in this? Between the lines. He shrugged. People like me don't get rich. We get included. Early information. A seat in rooms. We get told we're valuable because we know where all the calendar invites go. Adrian wrote 2 words on her pad. Soft power. What do you want? Blackwell asked, and the question was a light switch. The man looked at the windows again. I want to keep my job. That's the wrong room for that ask, the chief of staff said, not cruelly. This is the room where we fix what's broken. Then I want a safe runway to tell you where the hub sits, he said, swallowing whatever pride he'd packed as a snack. And I want you to stop pretending this only happened because a few people were bad. You built a machine that celebrates exceptions. It's efficient until it isn't. There it was, the sentence that threatened to turn the meeting into a mirror. Blackwell didn't argue with the physics. We're already changing the machine, he said. Start with the hub. There's now. The man took a breath and rewired his courage. He described a Slack channel that never included the wrong people, a folder that looked like a graveyard of drafts, and a calendar tag that meant walk it around without saying so. The choreography had a rhythm. A small invoice flagged for reimbursement from a legacy agreement. A note about brand alignment. A service credit that skipped a step because of timing. None of it monstrous. All of it cumulative. The hub wasn't a person. It was a habit, curated by 3 humans who thought they were being clever, and one who knew they were being paid. Names, the chief of staff said. The man gave them. One was already on ice, the director. One was a mid-level in operations whose superpower was polite persistence. One was an assistant who, on paper, merely assembled packets and was, in reality, the traffic light for micro-approvals. And the consultant, the one with decks, festive LinkedIn, thin substance, a talent for attaching himself to outcomes and then backdating his importance. Adrian flipped through her notes like she was shuffling a deck she'd marked ages ago. The assistant, she said. Who taught them the nickname? He winced. That was me. It made the emails feel friendly. Friendly is a wild choice for fraud's favorite seasoning. She set the pen down. You called me what interns who are still finding their feet call me. That's either familiarity you shouldn't have, or a test you hoped I'd fail. He shook his head quickly. I needed you to show up, and I didn't think you'd answer if you wrote alone, the chief of staff said. That word is your system in miniature. The man's shoulders gave an inch. I wanted to talk without lawyers. You got a room with lights instead, Blackwell said. You're not the villain of this, but you're not the hero either. You're a witness with a favorite seat. The man looked at his phone like maybe it had better answers. I'll send you the channel export. He wanted it gotten CHRAS. You'll send it now, the chief of staff said, pushing a small, company-issued laptop across the table. And you'll do it here. They watched him log in. Watched him hesitate at the prompt that always knows more than you want. Watched him click through the privacy warning like a person who had never read one in his life. A minute later, a folder populated. Names, timestamps, snippets of messages that sounded like administrative excellence and smelled like avoiding friction. Adrian felt it before she saw it. The timestamp pattern that trailed big decisions by a day or two, like a tide that understood how to disguise its loyalty. They're timing the exceptions to the news cycle, she said. When we announce something, they move micro money through the noise. The chief of staff circled a date. That was the week we announced the literacy grants. Blackwell's jaw worked once. There are moments when rage is too large for anger. He didn't yell. He closed his eyes, opened them again, and said, "We're done giving them our headlines as cover." The man cleared his throat. "There's one more thing." "Good," Adrian said. "Say it." "The consultant is angling for your foundation," he said. "He wants to formalize the evaluation process, introduce a niche uplift framework, his words that would basically let him assign multipliers to favored programs. He's already pitched the director of vendor relations on how to make the paperwork match the story." Blackwell exhaled like a person who'd just found a crack in a glass he'd been drinking from. "He won't touch the foundation." "You'll need to tell him that directly," the man said. "He thinks proximity is permission." The chief of staff stood, which, in that room, meant the conversation had reached the part where decisions become verbs. "Here's what happens next," he said. "Legal will schedule your interview. You'll be put on paid leave pending the review. You will not contact anyone we've discussed. You will send us every file, every screenshot, every scrap. In return, we'll note your cooperation. And if you're as useful as you think, that will matter." The man looked like he wanted a nobler word than cooperation. None arrived. He nodded, signed the form turned toward him, and left in a silence that wasn't hostile, just done. When the door clicked, the room felt bigger. Maybe it was the windows. Maybe it was the space you get back when a pretense leaves. "We keep the lights on," the chief of staff said. "No closed-door heroics." Adrian gathered the exports. "I'll thread these into the ledger. We can map the micro-exceptions against announcements and see exactly how they exploited peaks in attention." "Do it," Blackwell said. He looked tired in the old way, the pre-success way, when work and meaning shook hands instead of wrestling. "And then we're going to rewrite the machine." They didn't go for lofty. They went for practical. The first change was governance. An independent internal reviewer rotated quarterly, chosen by lottery from a vetted pool. No more permanent gatekeepers who learned everyone's shortcuts. The second was structure. 2 approval channels that never met until the final step. One that checked arithmetic. One that checked narrative. No checkbox could pass without a story a stranger could follow. The third was cultural and therefore the hardest. They outlawed just this once. People say it like a bandage. It's usually a knife. Just this once now required a written rationale. A countersign from someone whose bonus was not affected by speed, and a sunset clause with a date circled in red. Exceptions would expire unless resurrected by daylight. They set up anomaly heat maps not to make dashboards pretty, but to show where rhythm turned into ritual. They scheduled a monthly red team drill where a small group tried to break the system with the same creativity people had used to exploit it. If the red team won, nobody got punished. The system got smarter. At 9:21 p.m., the building had that after-hours hollow you hear in movies right before a plot twist. Adrian rubbed her eyes, looked at the heat map prototype she and an engineer had cut together, and wrote a note to herself. Flag spikes within 48 hours of public announcements. Auto-escalate. Small things, done consistently, build walls you can lean on. The chief of staff returned a call from legal. The conversation was all nouns. Affidavits, retention, custodians. He hung up, looked at Blackwell, and made the face of a friend who knows what a hard thing costs. "You're going to lose a few people," he said softly. "I know," Blackwell replied. "If the price of keeping them is pretending I didn't read what I read, we can't afford them." Adrian didn't say she was proud of him. She wasn't a fan of congratulating people for doing what was necessary. But she stood a little taller beside him, because sometimes alignment feels like posture. Her phone buzzed a text from a number that had never felt important until 10 seconds ago. The Director of Vendor Relations. 3 words. "I didn't start it." She typed back, "Then help end it." 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. The language of guilt is punctuation. They broke for 10 minutes, which mostly meant people stared at middle distance and remembered to drink water. When they reconvened, procurement arrived with a neat packet that looked suspiciously like a performance of compliance. The chief of staff refused the theater. "We're not playing Show Me You're Busy," he said. We're playing Show Me Where the Rot Began. The consultant will say best practice, procurement offered, as if invoking a saint. The consultant will learn a new practice, Blackwell replied. They mapped the exception path on the whiteboard. In dry erase ink, it looked absurdly simple. Green boxes for steps that worked, yellow for steps that could be bent, red for the places where the system politely looked away. The red boxes embarrassed the room. Systems should be ashamed sometimes. It keeps them from getting cocky. Hadrian sketched the narrative layer beside it. Every red requires a narrative. Who asked, why now? What risk? What alternative? And what changes because of this choice? If you can't answer those in plain language, you don't get the red. No jargon. No synergy. If you need to write niche to make it sound smart, you're already losing. The chief of staff underlined plain language like a person who collects underlines for a living. And everything gets logged in the decision ledger, he added. We treat choices like transactions. They leave footprints. They stayed until the markers died and the windows turned black enough to make their reflections look like a second audience. Somewhere around 10:30, the email pings slowed. The building exhaled, and the three of them, Blackwell, Adrian, and the friend who refused burials, stood in the doorway, not ready to call it a night, but smart enough to pause. What don't we want to know? The chief of staff asked again, the way some people say grace. That I liked the speed too much, Blackwell said. That I waited a week too long to draw the line, Adrian said, quietly. Because honesty should start at home. Okay, the chief of staff replied. Then we'll build a machine that slows you down just enough and forces you to draw the line the minute the pencil knows where it is. They gathered their things. Adrian slid the exports into a folder, handed Blackwell a printout with the kind of humility that doesn't need compliments, and turned off the recorder. The room went still. If you've ever done a hard thing with the right people, you know that stillness, it isn't emptiness. It's earned quiet. In the hallway, the floor lights made a runway to the elevators. They walked without talking for a few seconds. Then Blackwell said, "Tomorrow we talk to the foundation. I want them to hear this from us before anyone else imagines it for them." Adrian nodded. "And the clinic van? We fund them for the next 2 quarters today," he said. "No approvals, no delays. If we have to unspool donations later, we'll do it with our own money." The elevator arrived with a soft chime, like a stage cue. They stepped in, the doors slid closed, and the city started climbing onto them in the mirrored stainless steel. 3 figures, separate and joined by the sort of work that doesn't make press releases because it doesn't need to. Down in the lobby, the security guard lifted a hand. Outside, the night had tilted toward morning, that in-between place where decisions get either stronger or foggier. Adrian zipped her coat and felt the familiar weight of the thumb drive in her pocket. She didn't believe in talismans. She believed in backups. Her phone buzzed again this time. A calendar invite from an alias she didn't recognize. Optimization Brief Foundation. Attached was a deck. She opened it on instinct, and there it was, the consultant's masterpiece. Slides that used the word niche like a passport stamp. Arrows that pointed nowhere and looked dynamic doing it. A model that put a multiplier on storytelling ROI, as if compassion could be indexed like a stock. She took a screenshot of the cover slide and sent it to Blackwell with 3 words. "He's already circling." 3 dots. Then his reply, "Then we'll meet him in daylight." Howda, what is see the terma? They parted on the sidewalk, 2 cars in opposite directions. 1 pair of shoes choosing to walk because walking recenters the head. Above them, the building's crown of light finally dimmed. Not out, just down a notch. Enough to say, the story's not over. It's getting honest. And somewhere else in the city, a man with a portable smile was rehearsing lines for a pitch he didn't know had already expired. Morning arrived like a memo, informative, not gentle. The sky didn't bother with pinks or theatrics. It just turned up the brightness and asked everyone to act accordingly. By 8:12 a.m., the lobby had its weekday choreography, back badges tapping, coffee breathing steam like small engines, the revolving door rotating with corporate rhythm. But on the 19th floor, the oxygen felt different. Clarity does that, it repaints the air. Adrian stepped out of the elevator and met the look on the receptionist's face. Gratitude mixed with the quiet question, "Are we okay?" She didn't give false comfort. "We're getting there," she said, and kept moving. The decision ledger template sat open on her desktop like a fresh canvas. Rows waited for names, choices, reasons. She liked the order of it, the way a well-built table admits only what you can explain. At 8:30, the chief of staff slid into her doorway. "The foundation at 9, he said. "You good?" "I want to keep it human," she replied. "Numbers, yes, but also what those numbers canceled." She lifted a folder. Clinic van, literacy grants, the food program partnership. One deviation here erased an afternoon of screenings there. He nodded. "We're not doing shame, we're doing truth." They walked to the small boardroom that the foundation used when they came uptown. Less glass, more plants, the kind of room where donors felt like friends and friends felt like stakeholders. Blackwell arrived last, not because power does that, but because he had stopped in accounting and signed off on an immediate extension of the clinic van's funding. No press release, just a transfer and a promise. The foundation director, a woman with the steady eyes of someone who had learned to accept both gratitude and criticism without metabolizing either, greeted them with a hug that felt like mission, not theater. "Tell me straight," she said, sitting. "I already know there's smoke. I need to know about the fire." Blackwell didn't circle. "We discovered a path for micro-exceptions. It was curated, not accidental. Some people used our own noise to move small amounts that add up, too." "How small is small?" she asked. Adrienne passed the sheet. Monthly totals, not big enough to trend on charts, big enough to erase fragile things, enough to cancel a week of insulin if you let it run, enough to reduce our reading room hours in 2 neighborhoods. Not catastrophic, not ignorable. "And the fix?" the director asked, as if action were the only currency she accepted. "Already in motion," the chief of staff said. "Twin approval streams, narratives for every deviation, sunset clauses, red team drills, a rotating internal reviewer. We'll give you visibility into the ledger read-only, but real." "What about the consultant?" the director said, deadpan. "The one who likes frameworks with shiny names?" Blackwell's mouth tiled into a line that used to be a smile and had decided to take a break. "We're telling him no. In person. Today." "Good," she said. "Tell him we measure niche uplift by the kid who stops needing her inhaler in gym class. He can put that in a deck and see if it looks smart." They talked logistics for 10 minutes, the kind of work that turns a principle into a schedule. When they stood, the director touched the folder like a blessing. "You brought this early," she said to Adrian. "That matters. People show you who they are by the timing of their truths." In the hallway, they exhaled as a unit. It's odd how relief doesn't always feel lighter. Sometimes it just feels, well, real. Blackwell checked his watch. "Consultant at 11, he said. "Bring daylight." Daylight arrived with him. He wore it like a cologne. The consultant festive linked in, soft handshake entered the same glass room from last night and tried to own the corners. It's a trick. Take up space with confidence, and the room will shape itself around you. "Not today. Excited to share our niche uplift proposal," he began, sliding a deck across the table like a magic trick that required applause to work. "We've analyzed your philanthropic footprint and identified high-leverage multipliers that can—" "Stop there," Blackwell said, not unkindly. "We're not buying multipliers." The consultant's eyebrows made a pitch of their own. "I think you'll find the methodology robust. We've mapped sentiment vectors across." Adrian flipped to the middle slide. She'd read it at midnight and again at 7 a. "Your model indexes storytelling ROI as a proxy for impact," she said. "You're rewarding what's legible on platforms, not what's life-changing in the street." He smiled, the smile of a man who expected resistance and counted it as validation. Visibility is a force multiplier. If you can narrate the work scales. Sometimes the work doesn't want to be narrated, the chief of staff said. Sometimes telling a story about a thing changes the thing into something else, which is why we propose tiered discretion protocols, he replied. We help you decide when to go loud and when to go intimate, and we're not hiring you, Blackwell said, gentle as a gavel. Close the deck. Silence, then the consultant regrouped. If this is about procurement, it's about values, Adrian said, but also procurement. He recalibrated his smile, made it narrower. We advised best practice. You advised ways around friction, the chief of staff said, and you collected equity in a company that sells optimization with a flourish of buzzwords and a vacuum where customers should be. The consultant's gaze slid to Blackwell like a file seeking the last judge. This is how scale works, he said softly. You build exceptions into the system, little permissions that keep speed from suffocating. And then you mistake speed for competence, Blackwell replied. We're done with that mistake. He closed the deck himself, slid it back across the table like a check he refused to cash, and stood. We'll be in touch about the ethics review, he added. With the firm you report to, not with you. Meeting's over. At the sound, the consultant left with the careful dignity of a person who knows how to walk in expensive shoes when sidewalks turn honest. The door clicked. The room felt like it had shed a layer of performance and grown a spine. At 11:40, legal called. The director of vendor relations had retained counsel and would meet at 2. In the interim, the anomaly heat map bloomed on the screen in Adrian's office, clusters around launch weeks, predictable as tides. She layered the decision ledger atop the map and watched narrative entries begin to rewrite the company's muscle memory. There is a particular satisfaction in seeing a system accept new rules like a body learning a better posture. Her inbox chimed, an email from the assistant who had been the traffic light for micro-approvals. The subject line. Do you have a minute? The body. I didn't understand what I was part of. I thought I was helping speed things. I can walk you through how it worked. Adrian invited her to a small conference room with bad art and good chairs. The assistant arrived looking like a person who had slept near a line of worry and wanted, this once, to step over it. I'm not here to dodge, she said, sitting. I want to tell you how the signals worked. A high-end Aka. High-end. She explained the code, calendar tags that meant bring it in person, subject lines that hid the exception inside a phrase like timing alignment, a handful of innocuous emojis that meant green or yellow or not in writing. At first, it had looked like efficiency, then like indispensability. By the time it looked like complicity, she was deep enough in to mistake ache for purpose. Why stay? Adrian asked, not as a trap but as a map. I was useful, the assistant said, staring at a point on the table that had nothing to do with wood. When you grow up learning that useful is the same thing as loved, you stay useful. Adrian didn't moralize. She took notes, asked precise questions, and offered one truth like a glass of water. Being useful and being good aren't synonyms. We're going to rebuild a machine where they don't have to compete. The assistant cried without noise, the way people do when relief finally finds a path through dignity. She left with instructions and a promise. Cooperate. Tell it all. Help fix it. By early afternoon, the skeleton of the new governance lived on paper and in practice. Finance started a small, separate queue for philanthropic disbursements, a channel that could be audited against narrative outcomes without turning compassion into a chart. The Red Team draft had 3 volunteers already, each energized by the idea that trying to break a system was now a job description and not a secret hobby. At 2, the director of vendor relations walked in with a lawyer who had the kind of voice you hire when you plan to say, my client, several times in sentences that do a lot of crouching. The director looked smaller without the email signature. That's a common optical illusion. Remove a title. Discover the person. The chief of staff led. We're going to ask questions. You can choose to answer or not. Your counsel will advise. We're looking for facts, not theater. The director inhaled like a swimmer at a wall. I didn't design it, they said. The consultant pitched it. Best practice, he said. Everyone does it, he said. My mistake was not thinking through how it could be used badly. Adrian slid a printout forward, a series of micro-approvals with the director's initials in the margins. Always small, always just inside a threshold. Your pattern, she said, neutral. Not a smoking gun, a rhythm. What do you want me to say? The director asked, trying bravado on and finding it too big. That I liked being the person who could make things happen? That when you're the bottleneck everyone courts you? That a dozen little yeses felt like momentum in a job where nobody notices you unless something goes wrong? I didn't take money. Nobody said you did, the chief of staff replied. But you took worship, and you sold us speed. Silence. Then the director's lawyer leaned from script. What's the path here? She asked. Cooperation, remediation, and consequences. Blackwell said from the end of the table, voice even. Not necessarily in that order. They asked and answered in long arcs. The director gave up the consultant's pitch language verbatim, turns of phrase that sounded like the sound of smart rather than the practice of it. They admitted to knowing the assistant's role and not stopping it because stopping it meant slowing down what made them feel essential. They offered names of external relationships that suddenly looked less like partnerships and more like clever geometry. When it ended, nobody yelled. No drama. Just a signed statement, a badge surrendered, a laptop sealed in a bag, and the slow walk to an elevator that had always been there and never felt so inevitable. Consequences do their own lighting. The afternoon stretched. People did the next right thing in a dozen small ways. Rewriting templates, auditing lists, moving meetings. In Adrian's office, the ledger acquired its first truly beautiful column. What changed because of this decision? And entries began to accumulate with the kind of specificity that ends arguments before they start. Clinic van funded 2 extra days in Ward 6. Reading room extended to Saturdays. Vendor contract rebid with open review. The system was learning to tell a story about itself without spin. At 4:17, a message from comms. Do we say anything? The chief of staff typed back, no press, we fix. We put the foundation first. We answer questions if asked. Truth without theater. I use it can. Around 5, the sky tried a color and then gave up, settling into neutral daylight like it realized the city didn't need mood lighting today. Blackwell came to stand in Adrian's doorway, hands empty. That's how you know a person is present. Their hands aren't performing. You okay? He asked. I'm steady, she said. It was the most honest word. Good, he replied, because I'm going to ask something that sounds like a compliment but isn't. She tilted her head. I want you in the bigger room, he said. Not for prestige, for proximity. Help me rebuild this so I don't have to rely on moments of crisis to be my conscience. She didn't pretend to demur. Title or job? She asked. Job, he said. Titles follow jobs worth naming. Then I'll do it, she said. With one condition. He smiled. Of course there's a condition. No invisible work, she said. If we're going to make the story honest, the work has to be visible, and the people who do it need to be visible too. We don't replace one hidden path with another. Deal, he said, the kind of word that used to mean victory and now meant vow. They walked together to the small kitchen where the coffee tasted like decisions. In the window's reflection, the office looked like a place that could become itself again. On the way back, they passed the glass room from last night. It was empty, chairs still tidy from the morning's refusal, but the air held a residue of electric honesty. They paused without meaning to. This room works, he said. It's the windows, she replied. Rooms that glare back won't let you lie comfortably. At 6:03, the building softened. People drifted toward trains and dinners and children who needed help with math that looks like art. The core team remained, not with martyrdom, but with purpose. The decision ledger synced to shared read-only dashboards. The first red team drill found a tiny vulnerability, and everyone cheered because find means fix. The assistant who had been the traffic light sent a step-by-step guide to dismantling the old signals and then asked for a job on the new auditor rotation. The foundation director emailed a 2-line update that felt like oxygen. Clinic van funded through Q2. Literacy rooms staffed on Saturdays. Adrian shut her laptop and felt the fatigue that doesn't ask for pity. Blackwell picked up his jacket but didn't put it on. The chief of staff leaned in the doorway and ran a hand through hair that used to be less gray. "What don't we want to know?" he asked. "A ritual now." "That we're doing this for optics," Adrian said. "That we'll get tired and let convenience win," Blackwell added. "Okay," the chief of staff said. "Then tomorrow we write the parts that make quitting expensive." He left first. Adrian gathered her notes and the thumb drive talisman, habit, not superstition. Blackwell lingered like a man interviewing his own reflection for a role he wasn't sure he deserved and badly wanted to play right. At the elevator, Adrian's phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost let it go. Then she answered. A voice steady, unspectacular. The kind you don't remember until you really listen, said, "You don't know me. I'm from a vendor on the list you flagged. I've been told to keep my invoices a certain way for a year. If I send you everything, can you keep me out of the fire?" Axter I was home. "Send it," she said. "We're not burning the honest." "Thank you," the voice said, and hung up. The doors slid open. They stepped in. The car descended. In the mirrored walls, they looked like 3 versions of the same idea. The person who refuses to bury, the person who refuses to look away, and the person who refuses to be the story he used to tell about himself. Outside, the city did what cities do when you're having an epiphany. It kept going. That's the mercy and the dare. Across the street, a kid practiced free throws against a brick wall, counting silently. A woman argued with a parking meter and won. A man handed a stranger a spare umbrella like it was nothing, which meant it was everything. "You know," Blackwell said, half to the evening, "I used to think leadership was about being first. I'm starting to suspect it's about being last to give up." Adrian smiled, small and unadorned. "Then we're in the right niche," she said, and for once the word sounded exactly like what it meant. A fit carved by purpose, not convenience. They crossed at the light. Somewhere behind them, on the 19th floor, the decision ledger saved, backed up, and waited for tomorrow. Somewhere ahead, a consultant rehearsed a new pitch for someone else's windows. And in the middle, where stories actually live, 3 people went home a little quieter and a little stronger, carrying work that doesn't flash, only holds. The next morning didn't creep. It clicked on like a switch in a hallway you didn't realize you were standing in. The heat map Adrian had prototyped now lived on a proper monitor, a quiet constellation of points that pulsed where rhythm became ritual. She liked the way the patterns refused to flatter anyone. Maps don't care about reputations, they just show you. At 8:06 a.m., a new folder appeared in the shared drive anonymous upload. Vendor documents, file names that tried to look boring and failed. She opened the first PDF and met the voice from last night between lines of invoice prose. "We were told to itemize timing adjustments as service realignments. We were told it was best practice to help your team move faster." The words weren't an accusation. They were a confession written in polite font. She forwarded the packet to the chief of staff and tapped a message to Blackwell. "Vendor testimony corroborates the choreography. Meeting at 10 small room, good chairs." He replied with a single dot. It was their shorthand for received, already moving. "This I." Before 10, she did the work that never makes montages, matching invoice metadata to calendar tags, lining up emails that said nothing consequential with changes that did. She watched the light gray of her spreadsheet cells become a story as the columns learned how to talk to each other. This is what people miss when they think oversight is just a watchdog. It's also a translator. At 10 sharp, the vendor joined on video. He looked like people do when work is a survival plan. Wary, prepared, not here to be brave, just here to be accurate. His background was a spare office with a dying plant, a window that offered mid-tier sky, and a whiteboard where someone had written 3 bullet points and underlined the last one twice. He gave his name, then asked if he could read a statement. They said yes. I was told by your director's team that our invoices would move faster if we normalized small deltas as realignment. He read, voice steady. I didn't ask enough questions. We are reliant on your contract. I'm turning over emails and Slack captures. I'll cooperate fully. Thank you, the chief of staff said. Not performative, just the only correct sentence. Adrian asked precise questions that pulled on threads without shredding the cloth. Who sent the instruction? How did it arrive? Email, call, hallway? What words did they use? Did anyone ever write exception out loud? He answered cleanly. The instructions had been couched in a kind of professional charm. We can align this to timing. We'll handle the credit reversal in a subsequent cycle to avoid confusion. Please route through ops for visibility. Visibility is a lovely word for the kind of light that changes nothing. Why now? Adrian asked finally. Why tell us today? He glanced at the dying plant, at the window, then back at the camera. Because my kid's inhaler costs what it costs, and your van gave us ours last month for free. He swallowed. And because if my company can only survive by being useful to somebody else's shortcut, then we're not the company I think we are. The meeting ended without drama. They promised legal protection within the bounds of reality. He promised files. When the window closed, the room exhaled like a body that had been bracing. Put his invoices in the ledger crosswalk, the chief of staff said. We'll mark the decisions they intersected and what changed when we unspool them. Adrian nodded. She could feel the system getting smarter, the way you feel a room warm when a heater finds its rhythm gradually, then all at once. By noon, legal had a draft addendum ready for vendors. No more euphemisms, no more timing games, no exceptions without narratives that could survive a stranger's curiosity. Blackwell approved it with pen, not out of sentiment, but because pen slows you down just enough to notice what you're agreeing to. Then, a ping from finance. New anomaly. Credit reversal flagged as foundation alignment. Cross-account reference. Adrian stared at the screen. The phrase wasn't on any official playbook. It was consultant-scented, exactly the kind of perfume a shortcut would wear. She cross-referenced the entry with the foundation's disbursement log, read-only, just as promised. There it was. A temporary hold placed for documentation sync, followed 2 days later by a release tagged resolved via alignment. In the gap, a micro-exception had cleared on the corporate side. Not theft air traffic control, with someone using philanthropy as a holding pattern. Blackwell reached her doorway as she was building the visual. You're seeing it too? They're using the foundation's paperwork as a screen, she said, not dragging money out of the foundation, using its slowness to hide a sprint on our side. He went very still. Some truths don't want volume. They demand stillness so you can hear what they require next. We don't let the foundation become a decoy for our impatience, he said. Ever. They pulled the logs, built the side-by-side, and walked it to the foundation director at 1:15. She listened without theatrics, then asked the question you ask when your job is to keep a sacred thing from being turned into a prop. Does fixing this slow us down where it matters? Yes, Adrian said, but it slows us down in the way seatbelts do. Then buckle, the director replied, and show me, in the ledger, where we pay the speed tax and what we get for it. Back upstairs, they wrote a rule that felt like a hinge. No corporate exception may be timed to philanthropic review. If an exception touches a program we fund, the default is pause, not a symbolic pause. A real one. A pause that costs. Choices without costs are wishes. At 2:20, the vendor's files arrived, zipped, tidy, time-stamped. Adrienne ran them through a diff against the invoices on file, and found minor edits that shouldn't have been minor. descriptions tweaked to match alignment language, line items bundled in ways that made monitoring trivial only if you wanted it to be. One email thread ended on a sentence that felt like a slogan for the wrong team. "We'll keep this clean." Clean is the word people use when they want the surface to shine and the underneath to shut up. She sent the most instructive examples to the red team volunteers, along with a prompt: recreate this behavior in a sandbox. Tell us exactly how you did it and how our new rails stop you. An hour later, they replied with an outline and a video. The rails held. One attempted workaround didn't. They patched it and wrote the patch down where patches go now, not in the hero file, in the everyday instructions where culture lives. Around 3, comms pinged again, gentle but persistent. Story, inquiries rising. 2 reporters asking whether we're shifting foundation focus. What's true? The chief of staff wrote back what was true. We discovered a process, vulnerability, we're fixing it. Foundation focus is unchanged. Clinic van funded through Q2. Literacy rooms moving to Saturdays. If asked, we will say exactly that, without adjectives. Without adjectives is a surprising PR strategy. It has the virtue of sounding like you have nothing to hide because you don't. At 3:37, the consultant tried one more time, this time through a partner at his firm who wore gravitas like a tailored coat. "We're concerned about the message you're sending by severing our collaboration," the partner wrote. "Optimizing philanthropic niche selection is a recognized best practice." Adrian typed before she could stop herself. "Our niche is trust." She deleted it. Then she wrote the sentence that would travel. "We choose practices that assume the best and audit for the worst. We don't externalize our conscience." They hit send with the anticlimax that accompanies a line you know you'll stand behind later, when this is a case study and not a Tuesday. At 4, the air changed again the way it does when the day decides what kind of evening it wants to become. The director of vendor relations' counsel emailed an update. Their client would submit a fuller account. Attached were 2 pages of detail. The kind of thing people write when they understand that verbs are coming whether or not they deliver nouns. The pages named the assistant, already cooperating, named the consultant, already told no, and named 3 executives who had never touched an exception, but had created a move heaven and earth culture around deadlines that made exceptions feel like heroism. Blackwell read that line twice. Culture is comfortable to blame because it doesn't have a badge to surrender. He took out the notebook the chief of staff had insisted he use and wrote, in ink, "We built a speed altar." He stared at it. "I brought the candles. Then we'll bring the water," Adrian said, not merciful, just practical. By late afternoon, procurement had rebid 2 contracts in the sunshine. Operations had rewritten a checklist to make walk it around into log it or it didn't happen. And finance had built the smallest, loveliest graph. Deviations per week trending down. Narrative completeness trending up. The graph wasn't heroic. It was honest. At 5:12, a calendar hold. Union of Small Vendors listening session. Adrian clicked in surprise and found the organizer. The vendor from the morning. He wasn't asking for a platform. He was inviting them to hear how "help us move faster" sounds on the other end of the call when you're counting payroll in actual days. She accepted, added Blackwell and the chief of staff, and wrote 3 questions on a sticky note. What pressure did we export to you? What would fair look like? What guardrail would you trust? She stuck the note to her monitor like a small flag for a country they were still drawing. Then, because the universe has a sense of timing, a message from the clinic nurse lit her phone. A photo of a kid with a sticker on his t-shirt that said, "I can breathe in PE again." No caption. It didn't need one. Adrian forwarded it to Blackwell. 3 dots. Then, ledger entry. Why we pay the speed tax. At 6, the hallway outside Adrian's office filled with the polite shuffles of a building putting its day away. Inside, they stayed with the kind of stamina that isn't about martyrdom so much as momentum. The red team debrief was already on the books for Friday. The first rotating internal reviewer drew lots and smiled, like someone who'd never won a raffle and had unexpectedly gotten the right responsibility. The assistant who had helped turn signals into traffic raised her hand for the new narrative checkor and asked if they'd teach her what questions to ask when a story tried to hide in jargon. They would. Of course they would. As the windows turned black enough to become mirrors again, Blackwell leaned in Adrian's doorway, the way people do when they're trying not to rehearse a speech and failing. "I used to be proud that we could do in 3 weeks what took other people 3 months, he said. "I still want that. I just don't want the kind of speed that makes us strangers to ourselves." "Then we make speed honest," she said. "Speed with receipts. Speed that can survive daylight." He nodded. "And we make the daylight a habit." They stood there, the day rethreading itself into evening around them, when the chief of staff reappeared with a folder too slim to be dangerous and exactly thick enough to matter. "One more thing," he said, with the tone of a man who respects cliffhangers but prefers closure. The external consultant didn't act alone. The partner who emailed this afternoon, his firm placed a junior analyst inside a vendor as a liaison. "She's been ghostwriting justification narratives for exceptions." Adrian blinked. "Inside the vendor?" He handed her the page. There it was an email address with a firm domain, sending draft narratives to a vendor account for alignment. Clean sentences. Hands-off fingerprints. It would have looked like help if you wanted it to. Blackwell's jaw set. "We go to the firm. Not just the consultant. We go to their compliance head with this and ask a very simple question." "What question?" Adrian asked. "Whether they want to be in the ledger under repaired or removed." They booked the meeting. They attached the proof. And as the calendar invite flew into a future shaped like Friday morning, the building gave one last sigh, the kind of sound old ships make when someone finally patches the leak they've tolerated for too long. On her way out, Adrian paused by the glass room where they had invited the light and refused the deck. She could see her reflection, and behind it the emptiness of chairs that had done important work just by being ordinary. She thought about how many times rooms get named after donors. Maybe some rooms should be named after verbs. In the elevator, the three of them stood by their mirrored selves again. The person who writes things down so they can't be buried. The person who asks the room what it doesn't want to know. The person who used to love speed more than accuracy, and is learning to love both, in order, on purpose. Outside, the city's evening had a different pitch than yesterday's nothing you could measure, just an undertone you could feel if you'd spent the day asking for receipts from your own reflection. Across the street, a food truck's line cheered when somebody's number got called. A busker played something tender and brave for coins that didn't add up to his courage. And somewhere 12 blocks away, a kid breathed easy on a stickered chest and didn't think about budgets at all. Back home, Adrian opened her notebook and wrote one sentence, then boxed it like a heading for a chapter she hadn't meant to write and now couldn't imagine skipping. "We don't get better by speed. We get better by not lying to ourselves about what speed costs." Her phone buzzed. A final message, not dramatic, just new. "Tomorrow, small vendors, listening session. Bring no slides." She smiled. And because rituals keep you honest, she whispered the question into a quiet apartment that smelled faintly of tea and the end of a long day. "What don't we want to know?" 1, 5, 2. The answer came with surprising ease. That we did the right thing because it was easy. "Good," she said aloud to no one. "Because it isn't." She closed the notebook, set an alarm, and let the city do what it always does when you're trying to change. Keep being itself, which is the perfect test. Tomorrow would bring the firm, the liaison, and a room with people whose invoices were part plea, part promise. Tonight brought sleep, the kind that feels like consent to start again. They chose a room that refused conspiracy, a rectangle of daylight with windows on 2 sides and a table that squeaked if you leaned your elbows on it. At 2 a.m., the chief of staff put a tent card in the center that read simply, "Attendees." No names, no hierarchy. The message was obvious today. roles were verbs. The firm arrived in a small procession. The compliance head, a partner with courtroom posture, and, last, the consultant who wore optimism like armor. He set his bag down carefully, as if the table might take it personally. "We appreciate the opportunity to clarify," the partner began, measuring each syllable like it had a billable rate. "Our intent has always been to improve operational efficiency without compromising ethics." "Good," Blackwell said, seating himself at the far end where light hit his face evenly. "Then this will be simple. It's a..." Adrian slid a printout forward, email headers, timestamps, excerpts of Slack messages originating from a junior analyst with the firm's domain, sent to a vendor, drafting narratives to justify micro-exceptions. The compliance head adjusted her glasses in a way that suggested both surprise and a pre-existing headache. The consultant did not look at the paper. He looked at Blackwell, as if his face might be a weather report. "We don't direct vendor operations," the partner said quickly. "You embedded a liaison," the chief of staff replied. She wrote justification language that was then submitted as if it originated from the vendor. The consultant cleared his throat. "We suggested prototypes. You wrote our conscience in the passive voice," Adrian said, "and you called it best practice. Silence did the thing it does when facts don't need help." The compliance head flipped pages, then asked for a moment with her team. They stepped into the hallway too fast to be casual, not fast enough to be a sprint. Through the glass, Adrian watched their hands do small, frantic shapes. The consultant's gestures were wider. Wide gestures do poorly in rooms with honest furniture. When they returned, the compliance head did not bother with theatrics. "We will suspend the consultant and the liaison immediately," she said. "We will open an internal review. We will share our findings with you, and, if warranted, any relevant authorities." "Thank you," Blackwell said. "And one more thing. Your firm placed exception-seeking architecture into our culture under the auspices of efficiency. You will propose, at your expense, a dismantling plan. It should remove not only the language you helped craft, but the temptation it smuggled in." The partner started to protest contracts. Scope then saw the look on the compliance head's face and decided to admire the ceiling instead. The consultant tried one last swing. "This is how scale works," he said, softer than yesterday. "You either build speed into the machine, or the machine builds around you." He was si vendab. "Then we'll let the machine build around what we can live with in daylight," Blackwell replied. "Meeting's over." They left without slamming doors. The room felt taller. By 11, the red team drill was live. Adrian watched a monitor as a volunteer team tried to reproduce yesterday's foundation alignment trick in a sandbox. The new rail's twin streams, narrative checks, time of announcement flags stopped them cold on the second hop. When they cheated toward a different hop, a prompt demanded plain language. "Why now? What risk? Who pays? Who pays?" Stalled them for 4 minutes. Which was the point. Exceptions should sweat. At lunch, the small vendor's listening session filled a community room 10 blocks away with metal chairs, a coffee urn, and the sort of folded arms that mean, "We came to see if you mean it." The vendor from yesterday moderated like a man who had been both a supplicant and a partner and chose the latter. He asked Adrian to open. She didn't bring slides. "We exported pressure onto you," she said. "We celebrated speed and called it partnership. We're changing that. I need to hear how to do it without making your life worse." A woman in a jean jacket raised her hand. "Stop asking for documents you won't read," she said, then using those unread documents as reasons to delay payment. "He's of Clade Wes." A man with a baseball cap and a neat notebook added, "If you want us to narrate exceptions, give us the questions up front. Let us answer once, not 12 times, to 12 slightly different requests." Another voice, "Your calendar is a traffic jam. When we're told to walk it around, we learn that your visibility is really code for favor. Kill the phrase." They wrote everything down. Back at the office, they killed the phrase. They replaced it with a portal that demanded the same story from everyone. One upload, one narrative, one decision logged in the ledger, where what changed because of this would now include what changed for our vendors. Way too hind of Leithterang. In procurement, resistance tried on a tie and introduced itself as practicality. The chief of staff listened, agreed where agreement was due, and told the truth where it wasn't. We made a mess with 100 polite moves, he said. We'll fix it with 100 impolite truths. By mid-afternoon, the anomaly heat map had fewer red points near public announcements, and a few bright yellows near quarter-end close. New tendency, Adrian wrote beneath it. When we remove one cover, another gets loud. They set an alert to watch quarter-end like a hawk with a calendar. At 4:02, the assistant who had once been the traffic light walked in with a list she had titled, "With Disarming Precision. The Ways We Cheated Ourselves." It contained 23 bullet points, each a tiny practice that made the bad thing easier. Subject lines that hide meaning. Calendar holds with ambiguous titles. Over-reliance on trusted initials. Emoji as governance. She handed it to Blackwell with both hands. Like a fragile thing. He read it, looked up, and said, "You belong on governance design." She blinked. "As penance? As expertise," he said. At 5, the compliance head from the firm emailed a formal notice. The consultant and the liaison suspended. Internal review launched. A proposal within 72 hours for dismantling the exception scaffolding. She used fewer adjectives than yesterday. People who intend to be believed use fewer adjectives. The day closed the way honest days do, without applause. Adrian walked past the windows and watched the city do what it never apologizes for. Carry on. On her phone, a reminder she'd set months ago for a writing class she used to take on Wednesday nights, when work didn't follow her home like a dog that loved too hard. She canceled it and didn't feel guilty. Sometimes, growth is choosing the right unfinished things. At her desk, she wrote a single line to live above the ledger's newest tab. We do not ask others to absorb costs we are too proud to admit. Then she closed her laptop and let the day end like a good argument clear. Respectful, unresolved only in the ways that keep you coming back. Thursday dawned with an ordinary sky and an extraordinary list. Operations rolled out the new 2-stream approval in 3 pilot teams. Finance turned on the quarter-end watch list. Legal shipped the vendor addendum with plain language and a hotline number that didn't route to a labyrinth. Comms drafted truth without theater and parked it in a drawer labeled, "If Asked." Adrian started with choreography, not dance the map. She pinned printouts to a wall. Calendars, ledger excerpts, heat map snapshots, a column of quotes from vendors who had spoken yesterday. Thread by thread, the web of how it moved came into focus. You could see the rhythm now. Announce eyes elsewhere, micro-exception cluster, reconciliation, smoothed ledger quiet. It looked like a heartbeat chart for a patient who had learned to hide palpitations. Patterns are contracts with the past, she wrote in the margin. We're tearing this one up. Blackwell joined with coffee he'd carried himself. Title met habit. Walk me, he said, and she did. How quarter-end created a gravitational pull toward forgiveness. How legacy agreement became a magic word. How exception whispers clustered on days when executives were airborne, unreachable in the name of scale. He listened without ego, like a person who'd learned how expensive his reflection could be if he loved it too much. He pointed at a pattern. Small approvals spiking the day after investor calls. We give speeches about discipline, he said quietly, and then we spend the next day moving chairs around fast enough to feel the speech. Then we'll write a counter-ritual, Adrian replied. On the day after investor calls, exceptions freeze for 24 hours. Not as punishment, as recalibration. Do it, he said. By late morning, the first red team debrief read like a thriller for people who find guardrails exciting. They'd tried 5 attacks. The rails caught 4. The 5th, a bundle then split trick that hid 2 micro-exceptions inside a legitimate amendment, almost made it through. It hit the narrative check and stalled. The story couldn't be told in 3 plain sentences. We thought that rule was cute, a red teamer admitted. Turns out it's a wall. At noon, the foundation director sent a list of programs least photogenic and most vital. If your niche uplift friends ask what multiplies impact, she wrote, tell them it's the slots nobody signs up to brag about. Attached was a line from a parent. My daughter can play trumpet now because the asthma is under control. Adrian copied the sentence into the ledger under what changed and circled it like a talisman that didn't need superstition. After lunch, operations walked in with reluctant admiration. Your portal works, they said. I hate that it works, but it works. You hate that speed now has receipts, the chief of staff replied. Operations shrugged. I hate that I can't be clever. Good, Adrian said. Clever was our problem. This is sound that keep hing them. That keep hing his eyed. They installed a tiny, decisive feature. When someone tried to use legacy agreement as a reason, the portal demanded an attachment, a scanned page, not a memory. Legacy dies today, the chief of staff said, dry. It can live on in a museum. Mid-afternoon crowned itself with a surprise. An email from a former employee who had left 2 years ago for a startup that wore the word disruption like a hat. Saw the news cycle noise, she wrote. If you're rebuilding governance, you'll want to know the places we cut corners during the last system migration. Not fraud. Laziness. We called it pragmatism. It will bite you in 6 months if you leave it. Adrian invited her in. People who confess laziness are valuable. They know where the floorboards are soft. For an hour, the former employee walked them through temporary bypasses that had petrified into standard. They added the list to the dismantling plan. Somewhere, an engineer felt seen. At 3:50, the partner from the firm sent the promised dismantling draft. It was better than expected and worse than required. Too many maybes, the chief of staff said. We need musts. Adrian edited inline. Replace consider with implement. Replace target with remove. Replace sunset with a date. The compliance head accepted most changes and asked for a week. 4 days, Blackwell said. If your culture can't move at that speed, bring fewer adjectives. In the late afternoon lull, Adrian checked the quarter-end watch. A yellow spike flickered in a small team's queue. 2 micro-exceptions flagged as customer urgency. The narrative read, "We'll lose goodwill." She picked up the phone. "Tell me the customer's name," she said. The manager hesitated. "If you can't say it on the phone," Adrian continued, "you can't press the button." "It's habit," the manager admitted. "We've always smoothed these." "Then break the habit," she said, "and write what losing goodwill means in numbers and names." The exception died on the table. In the ledger, a new entry, lost 5 hours, saved a culture. At 5:30, the listening session notes hit her inbox vendors, asked for predictable pay cycles, for one human name on the company side, for a rule that says if you can't explain a request in plain language to a non-expert, you can't make it. She added them to the governance page titled, Promises We Can Keep. Promises are cheap. Kept promises are assets. Evening came with the smaller noises of a building going to sleep. The chief of staff leaned on the doorframe again. Ritual looked good on him. What don't we want to know? That we are exceptions-proof, Adrian said. That we are done, Blackwell added. Then let's not be, the chief of staff said, and left them with the right size of ambition, unfinished on purpose. On her walk home, Adrian passed a mural she'd never really seen, the kind you ignore until your attention learns new muscles. It said, in bright, stubborn letters, "Build what you won't have to apologize for." She took a picture she didn't intend to post. Some reminders are better in your pocket than on a feed. That night, the vendor who had spoken first at the listening session sent a photo of a newly printed invoice with a little smiley face in the corner. Submitted through the portal, he wrote. No walking it around. Felt weird. Felt good. Wait. Adrian forwarded it to the team and to Blackwell with a caption that wasn't irony. Niche uplift. He responded with an emoji he had never used in his life, a simple check. Friday opened with an early meeting and a late lesson. The firm's compliance head arrived on time with a shorter deck and a longer face. She had brought a list of musts, as requested. Decommission the exception language, revoke the liaison program, audit every template introduced during their engagement, mandatory retraining for their people on client boundary ethics. The partner kept quiet. The consultant was not invited. 2 more. Adrian said, scanning. First, you publish an internal case study not about us by name, about you on how optimization becomes complicity when you stop asking for whom. Second, you fund an external workshop for small vendors on navigating enterprise procurement without shortcuts. The compliance head held her gaze, then nodded. We'll do both. When they left, the chief of staff wrote one line at the bottom of the dismantling plan. If you're embarrassed to teach it, you shouldn't be doing it. At 9:40, comms walked in. 2 outlets pinged again, they said. One piece will run with or without us. They're asking whether foundation priorities are shifting and whether a senior leader was removed. Is this MOF? Tell them the truth in nouns, the chief of staff said. Priorities unchanged. We discovered a process vulnerability. A leader is on leave pending review. Clinic van funded. Literacy rooms extended. Ledger building. No adjectives. It felt exposed. It felt right. At 10:15, the first rotating internal reviewer, a quiet analyst from Risk, who collected fountain pens and rules, presented a tiny miracle, a temporal friction index. It scored exceptions not just by size, but by when they occurred and what they tried to hide behind. Announcements, board weeks, quarter ends, travel days. We can wait friction placement, he said. If your exception shows up under a big shadow, the system asks harder questions. Blackwell grinned small. Earned. We'll pay a bonus for that, he said. Make it a library budget, the analyst replied, deadpan. I read policy for fun. They added a line in the ledger for each exception, friction index score. Culture changed when you measured what it worshipped. At noon, the foundation director joined a working lunch. No catered trays. Sandwiches, fruit, coffee that had made peace with being coffee. They walked through the firewall between corporate exceptions and philanthropic timing. Our default is pause, the director said. If an exception touches us, it waits until we can explain it to a nurse without wincing. Deal, Blackwell said. He'd started to like that word differently. Then, the afternoon brought the room with too many windows back to life. The vendor with the dying plant appeared on the screen again, this time with a background that looked brighter. I told my team we're not doing alignment code words anymore, he said. They laughed. Then they said okay. Good laugh or bad laugh? Adrian asked. Scared laugh, he said. Then okay. They hung up, and the assistant turned governance designer rolled in a cart with a new onboarding module. On the cover, in big, unpretentious font, exceptions without lies. Inside, scenarios that refused glamour. A late invoice because a courier actually did get stuck in a flood. A price change because a vendor had to pay hazard wages. A timeline shift because a junior went home to care for a parent. Each scenario ended with the same questions. Who pays? Why now? What changes because of this choice? Then the ledger line. What will we be proud to say out loud next month? By 3, the quarter-end watch had saved them twice more small clusters flagged, narratives rewritten, one denial that came with relief instead of resentment. Operations stopped by with a confession. I slept better last night. Adrian wrote it in her notebook under effects that don't fit on charts. Late afternoon bent toward evening with a meeting nobody wanted and everyone needed. The director of vendor relations returned with their counsel for a final interview. The lawyer had softened. The director looked less like a title and more like a person who had misplaced a decade. They answered questions with fewer hedges. When asked, what would you change if you could rewind? They didn't reach for absolution. I would have told myself that being indispensable is a drug, they said, and that I was dosing the company. There was a long, brave pause. The chief of staff nodded once, slowly. Thank you. And Dustin tend, he pressed on with a quieted whine. Consequences followed, as they must. The director resigned. The company accepted with gratitude for cooperation and with clarity about harm. No parade, no spectacle, just an ending that didn't excuse and a process that didn't gloat. At 5:15, a ping. The red team found a hairline crack, a wording loophole in the vendor addendum that could allow a clever narrative to skip the portal using pilot language. They'll try to call it a pilot, the volunteer wrote. Pilots are just exceptions with a better hat. Adrian and legal rewrote 2 sentences. Pilots now required pre-registration, public internal notice, and an expiration that screamed when ignored. The portal wouldn't recognize a pilot without those fields. Culture shifted another inch. As the building's lights began to meet the city's, Blackwell appeared in Adrian's doorway with the clinic photo she'd sent printed on real paper. He pinned it to the corkboard above her screen. Decision Ledger Exhibit A, he said. Exhibit always, she corrected. He was about to leave when the chief of staff arrived with a last envelope. Small Vendors Union sent a draft, he said. They want to formalize a standing quarterly listening session. They called it a covenant. Adrian opened it. The language was simple, muscular. We agree to be seen. We agree to be heard. We agree to say no to shortcuts, yes to delays that tell the truth, and to hold each other to receipts instead of rumors. At the bottom, 3 blank lines for signatures. Sign it, Blackwell said. Sign it and publish it, the chief of staff added. We'll be asked why we'd put ourselves on the hook in public. Because hooks keep boats from drifting, Adrian said. They signed. Evening pressed its face to the glass. The windows offered them their reflections and, behind those, the city's insistence on being itself. The room with too many windows had stopped being a stage and started being a habit. Bring the light. Ask the smallest honest question. Write it down. Refuse the heroics that make you feel clean and leave the floor dirty. On the way out, they passed a wall where facilities had put up a new placard. Room names. Someone had scratched a suggestion in pencil beneath it. Not after donors, not after birds or trees. After verbs. Listen. Repair. Pause. Declare. They smiled. Maybe verbs would do better at governance than nouns. The elevator doors opened. They stepped in. 3 figures that no longer needed the mirror to agree on who they were at work. Outside, a busker played the same brave song as 2 nights ago, a little steadier now, and a couple shared a sandwich like a vow. A vendor somewhere hit a submit button on a portal that didn't ask him to be clever, just honest. A nurse checked a box that meant a kid would not wheeze in PE on Monday. And up on 19, the decision ledger glowed in the dark like a lighthouse built out of receipts and sentences that could survive sunlight. It wasn't a happy ending, it was a responsible middle. They didn't call it victory. They called it Friday.